A special welcome to all the alumni of our nursing school here at UPMC Mercy for your annual Mass to remember those who have died. In 126 years of our nursing school here at Mercy, over 7,000 graduates in the healing profession of mercy continues to bring healing ointment to our world. Today's gospel, deposit your 2 cents for the kingdom. There was a young Jesuit priest who went to work with Mother Teresa of Calcutta in India. And he was a young priest, and he said it was a very transformative time of his life. And he learned 3 specific lessons from working with Mother Teresa of Calcutta and working with the dying in India. He said Mother Teresa first taught him her insistence that the greatest need in life is to have greater trust. Greater trust in God, greater trust in humanity, and greater trust in oneself. MF, the Hebrew word, to lean our life to totally dependent on God and His providence. Secondly, Mother Teresa taught that the absence of love is the greatest poverty in the world. Lovelessness is sin. Thirdly, Mother Teresa taught this young Jesuit that the Eucharist is not only the center of our worship on the Lord's Day, but it is the center of our concern for the poor, the unweaned, those without substance. Few of us can read these stories today of 1 Kings or Mark chapter 12, verses 38 to 44, of the story of widows without being deeply touched. It demonstrates how powerfully humility and lowliness pleases the Lord. True humility means radical dependence on God for everything. How compassionate and sensitive Jesus is to notice the poor widow's contribution in the temple of Jerusalem. Jesus grasps the immensity of her generous charity. Jesus looked beyond the outward, superficial, or surface style of appearances and saw that she put her heart into all that she gave. This widow serves as an inspiration for us and a consolation for us when at times when we experience a drought in our life or a famine in our life, or when we feel poor, powerless, and even impoverished, that God will provide. As He provided for the prophet Elijah, who was told to go to a foreign town, to a foreign woman, who gave what she could with her flour and oil and made a hearth cake for the prophet. And he promised her that God would provide rations for her beyond all imagining. A widow in the Jewish culture was one who was silent, one who was unable to speak. A widow was bereft, lonely, abandoned, because her husband had died. And according to Hebrew inheritance laws, they were considered excluded. So she had to be concerned about day-to-day provisions and providing for resources. The widows had many strikes against them. She was nameless and unnoticed. She was insignificant and invisible. She was unprotected by society, obscured and ignored, exploited and vulnerable, powerless and inadequate. The widow had no support system, no credentials, no status, no safety nets, no resources. But she knew the key to the kingdom was to trust in God. and her spirit soared beyond all bounds. Jesus reminds us it's not the amount of our donation, but the ardor of her love that she gave the most precious gift of all that she had. Thus, the benchmark is not the quantity, but the purity of our intentions and the abundance of our hearts to give all. One can see lots of people have lots of money, but can still be on empty. She was poor by the standards of the world, but she was rich in God's grace. The widow's offering represents the Christ-like act of laying down our lives for others. She gives freely and totally and unconditionally, without limit. Not out of self-importance, not in order to win the praise of peers, not to get recognition or fanfare, but she gives simply because she believes that God gives. And because God gives, it impels us to give to others. That was the authenticity of her love, and her belief is in the sacred offering that she gives quietly with a loving, faithful heart. Jesus points out that this poor widow is a generous model for all Christian life. It's significant in Mark's gospel that he places this story before Jesus' description of the final judgment in Mark chapter 13, verses 1 to 37. When the Lord returns, will he find a people who are humble and needy, willing to surrender their lives totally to him? Or will he find people full of pride and arrogance, who have no room for him in their hearts? Let us learn from the lesson of the widows today. Let us try to be givers rather than takers. Help us to live to give and not to take. Help us to help others and not be an hindrance to others' holiness. Help us to build one another up and encourage one another and support one another and not tear down one another. To encourage rather than criticize, to be thoughtful and kind and really listen to the troubles of others and be motivated by genuine caring and charity for others. That we will be divested of ourselves, of the superfluous things, the surface things of life, and prioritize the things that really matters. Being humble always. Being God-dependent people always. And sharing what we have to the best of our abilities. In the eyes of others, the offering of the woman was the least of all. But in the eyes of Christ, it was the greatest of all. The temple will pass away, but the woman's sincerity and generosity will live on in God's sight whenever the gospel is preached. No act of charity ever passes unnoticed or goes unrewarded by God. For God will never be outdone in generosity, Paul reminds us. Real giving must be sacrificial. It's the spirit in which we give. It's not the amount or the size of the gift, but the spirit and the sacrifice that is put into any gift that we render to another. Real generosity, Mother Teresa says, is when it hurts. It costs us something. It asks a demand of us. Both of these widows today show us the recklessness of giving. We may feel in life that we are at a drought or dried up or at a famine, and we have nothing to offer. Maybe no material gifts or personal gifts or meager talents to offer. But if we put it at Christ's disposal, he can do with it and with us beyond all human imagining. The world may take little note, nor long remember what we do in our daily life or ministry, but Christ will always remember. There's no assignment that's too small. No task beneath our human dignity. No service is without meaning or effect. When we open our hearts to the angels of pastoral love, we find Christ is rich in mercy, compassion, healing, and hope for the world. In 2 Corinthians chapter 8, verse 9, Paul writes, Jesus became poor, although he was rich, so that by his poverty you might become rich. God does not judge us by the value of the immediacy of results as the world sees them, or the acclaim of others. What really matters is the spirit of fidelity to do the will of God in our lives. In all things and in all circumstances, we must build up God's kingdom by depositing every day a faith contribution of 2 cents that will continue to multiply. Our being increases to the degree we spend it on others and give it away by trusting love for the Lord and the coming of his kingdom.